Right. Well, hello, Carole.
Hello, Leslie. It's really nice to see you.
It's really nice to see you too.
Yeah.
I'm speaking today with Dr. Carole Sherwood, and I'm so happy to be able to have this conversation. We became acquainted about a little less than a year ago, I think, somewhere around then, when you were working on a report on politicization of therapy and therapy education with Dr. Kirsty Miller. And that's been a really interesting, that what has been brought forth through that report has been really interesting. And you've also contributed to the Cynical Therapies book as an author. And when I was speaking with Dr. Kirsty Miller, we touched very briefly on CBT and some issues around that, which that it was new to me to think that that was controversial. And I've since spoken with some students, and I've learned that it has become very controversial recently. Um, and
Right.
so you offered to talk a little bit about that with me and share some insight. And I wonder if first I'd love to talk with you about that. And if you don't mind, could you start and just sort of introduce yourself and tell a little bit about how your work and how you've come to be where you are with this?
Sure, of course, Leslie. No, that'd be a great pleasure. So I'm actually retired or semi-retired now, clinical psychologist. And I actually trained quite late in life. And this was a message I wanted to send to some of the students who are really worried at the moment. I didn't actually train until I was 48. And I'd had quite a few careers in the entertainments industry and working with children with Down syndrome and so on before then. So I came to it late, and I started my training, I suppose it must have been about 2001. And when I finished my training, my particular area of interest was physical health conditions, things like chronic pain and so on. And I went to work in a London hospital, a teaching hospital, where I worked with people with HIV and then subsequently cancer and palliative care. And I really found that incredibly rewarding work. And I actually retired, I think it was 2013, and went on to run my own practice. And I thought that I'd done with psychology, really. And I retired, I was baking cakes, I was gardening, things like that. And then 2020 happened, and it was actually seeing what was happening to Kirsty Miller, because she was raising concerns with the British Psychological Society that there was no debate about them introducing a politicised agenda. And she actually wrote a letter to the Psychologist, which is the journal of the British Psychological Society, and it was taken down because of the huge uproar that it caused amongst activist psychologists. And that's the point at which I got involved, because I saw this happening. I was absolutely appalled. I could not believe that people who called themselves clinical psychologists could behave in the way that they did, slurring people, the language that they used. And so that's what's drawn me in. And I'm now very active in Critical Therapy Antidote, which I know that you are too, Leslie, as I think most of us are now. And so I'm trying to do my bit, as much as I can, to try and combat some of this, and try and be able to have these open conversations like I'm having with you about the difficulties that are happening, because all the doors are closed now. It's very difficult to have these conversations. It's another reason why we wrote the book, to try and raise awareness in the public sphere of what's going on here.
I think that's very noble at this point to bring it out, and you're coming out of a comfortable retirement baking cakes and gardening, which sounds so lovely, and yet feeling called back into this.
Yeah, I don't feel quite as courageous as you, Leslie, because I think, people like you, Leslie, and we have, I don't know whether you know of Amy Gallagher and James Esses in this
Mm-hmm,
country.
mm-hmm.
Both of them are psychotherapy trainees who put their careers on the line to make protests about what is happening in their professions. So I think all of you are incredibly courageous, and I'm lucky I'm not somebody that can really be cancelled anymore. And I suppose that does give me the ability to try and fight back a bit, and sort of let people know what's going on without fear of what might happen to me in my career.
That's something that Val Thomas mentioned as well when I spoke with
Mm.
her, that sense of being uncancelable and having
Mm.
having some security. I sort of felt like that when I started this as well, because I felt like the internet is this illusory world, and I had already decided that I wasn't going to pursue licensure prior to starting these conversations. But yeah, it is an interesting time to enter this conversation. It's an interesting conversation to have. And when you said that you were sort of shocked at that these were psychologists and counselors who were behaving in this way, that's been a real, that's made such a stark impression on me as well. Like, I couldn't believe that I was in an applied psychology program where I was hearing the kinds of things that I was hearing. And one thing though is that program that I was in until very recently seemed to really celebrate CBT. That was one of the modalities that we talked about most. It ran as a thread through a lot of the teachings. I think it's because it fits very well with the medical model in a lot of ways. It fits really well with insurance billing and being able to create smart treatment plans for clients and patients. And CBT is a nice, tidy modality for that, I guess. And so I was in school as recently as last summer was the last time I took classes, and I wasn't hearing any controversy around this. But recently I spoke with actually an Antioch student who reached out to me because of their concerns with the program. And she echoed this, that now it's very much a buzz in the program that CBT is this harmful, and it's becoming passé in the way that it's looked at it. And I'm kind of surprised at how rapidly that seems to have taken on. And what insight do you have around this, and what's going on with CBT?
Well, I was surprised too, Leslie, and I think it was only when I started working with Kirsty on the report, and we were looking into literature to see, how has this come about? What is there out there that we can find? And Kirsty came across an article on a website which talked about epistemic violence and CBT, and I thought, what do you mean? So the theory of knowledge is violent. And I was already aware, I don't know whether you've come across Nick Haslam's papers, Australian psychologist, who talks about concept creep and harm inflation, which I think we've all seen. People talking about trauma, they don't actually referring to something like post-traumatic stress disorder, which has got very fixed criteria. You actually have to have experienced or feared that you were going to die in a situation. But now it's sort of been downgraded, so that even thinking that you've been bullied, or you read a word that you don't like in a book, is trauma. Okay. So I thought epistemic violence, I wonder if that sort of fits into that category. So I read the article and I made a few notes about why CBT was being accused of epistemic violence. And I think the whole thing ties in with this critical social justice having an anti-scientific view. It's very, it accuses the science that underpins our clinical psychology, because it's a scientific discipline. It accuses it of being weird, Western educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic.
I haven't heard that acronym before. Oh, yes. That's interesting.
They refer to it as weird. Okay. It's obviously been very carefully thought out. And also they keep talking about, Eurocentric knowledge. And okay, so what does this all mean actually? And the argument seems to go that because the epistemology, kind of rationalism and empiricism, come from the Enlightenment period, when people who had power at that time were said to be imposing this ideology. Well, I mean, we think about critical social justice as an ideology, but the idea that somehow Western knowledge was superior to all other knowledges. So I think Spivak, she's an Indian post-colonial theorist, I think she wrote a book called Can the Subalterns Speak? So this is somebody who's marginalized and oppressed. And she says epistemic violence is the process by which non-Western methods or approaches to knowledge are obstructed by the imperialist Western understanding of knowledge. So that there's an immediate tension there that non-Western ways of knowing, if you like, are being suppressed. They're considered inferior in some way to the Western ways of knowing, which come from colonialism and imperialism. And CBT is seen as being one of those theories, if you like, one of those approaches. It's rational, it's empirical, it's evidence-based, and so it's problematic. And one of the main issues that activists seem to have with it is that the idea that it corrects people of colour's ways of knowing, if you particularly think about lived experience. So objectivity, if you imagine in a CBT session what you were doing, because CBT is interested in objectivity and being able to look at somebody's subjective experience and step back and say, okay, are there other ways of looking at this situation, that might actually be more helpful for you, or might actually be more truthful? But because objectivity is viewed as oppressive, as is science and Western science, and now CBT, the idea that you might question a person of colour on whether their subjective experience could be perhaps a little off the mark invalidates the lived experience of people of colour. And what is said is that CBT therefore protects oppressive systems in the West. Are you following this? Because I'm hoping I'm making sense here.
Yes. Yeah. And I think that's it's one of the things that I don't know if it's been said, but like I can understand how a little bit of this controversy could be in American psychotherapy, maybe because there's this, this mix of people from different cultures all blending into one country. I mean, it's a country that's such a mishmash of different cultures. But you're in the UK, and why would it be wrong to have Western thinking in Eurocentric? Why is it wrong to be Eurocentric in Europe? Why is that even a question? I'm just curious about that. How is that controversy there?
Okay, well, I think part of it's imported from the States, but I think another part is that we do have a very multicultural society here in the UK. And for many years, I think a lot of people from minority groups have felt that clinical psychology in particular, which includes CBT, I suppose, is very white, very dominated by white middle-class women like myself. And I think many of us have agreed with that and said, actually, it does need to be more diverse. And so the doors have been opened far more in the last few years to minority groups. And that's excellent. I applaud that. I think that's brilliant. But some of those people, I believe, have an agenda, which is an activist agenda, and have felt quite sore about, well, understandably, about perhaps racism that they've experienced in the past. And it feels like things like CBT are just seen as part of the whole whiteness structure, because they are scientific in their approach. So I think it's probably a mixture of things. It's the being exported from the States. It's our multicultural society, which is actually very tolerant. There's just, you wouldn't believe this, there's just been a report, I think it's King's College London, that shows that the UK is amongst the most tolerant of countries in the world. You wouldn't believe it from what's being said about it. So I think, yeah, it's a bit of activism, it's a bit of importing, and a bit of, people feeling aggrieved that they haven't been given a chance before. And I understand that, but I'm not sure that doing this and taking this kind of way of trying to deal with this is the most helpful way to deal with it.
And I can understand that as well. And the idea of having a tolerant society where people can get along across culture of course, I agree that that's, a very good thing to strive towards. And yet their own argument, the argument that we hear from the CSJ people, is that we should celebrate Indigenous culture. And if the European, and dare I say the white European, is the Indigenous culture of like the UK, for instance, how do they make the argument that that is something that needs to be overridden by something else? Isn't that colonialism in and of itself? And maybe I'm getting too deep into this loop.
No, you're not, Leslie, because I mean, that's a really interesting point you make, because when I knew I was going to talk to you, I found this excellent piece in a magazine called The Critic, which we have in this country. I don't know whether you have it in the States. And there was an article by a man called Patrick Porter, and he was talking about decolonization, and he was making exactly this point. Decolonization itself is a Western concept. It's actually, how would it be possible for the activists who are questioning the kind of science, Western science that we have, how would it be possible for them to do this if they didn't have that scientific basis to draw upon? The ability to verify things, the ability to falsify things, the ability to carry out research in the first place. And I think there are some people who've gone down the decolonizing route who also feel very uncomfortable about this, because they think, actually, this is a Western concept too. And like you say, maybe there is a sense in which the colonization is going in the opposite direction. Critical social justice is colonizing psychology and psychotherapy. Just that,
that is
we're thinking along the same lines here.
It seems like there are a lot of contradictions, even more, as you go through it, there are more and more. And I guess that makes sense when you're talking to an ideology that equates rationality with something to be what do they say, deconstructed.
Absolutely.
Well, that's interesting. And I know I kind of took you on a tangent there, but CBT, though, as you say, it's something that's designed to sort of take a more objective view of an issue and ask questions. And you talked about how that and it's not just CBT, you would use that with any client. It wouldn't just be a client of particular demographics. It would be useful for lots of people in lots of situations where we have thought distortions, cognitive distortions that are causing us anguish or frustration or difficulty in our lives. And can you give some examples of why this is being problematized by those that would problematize things?
I think it's because it's seen as victim blaming. I think because if you think about this, maybe I should give you an example, Leslie. I'll give you an example from the chapter that I've written, because I think this is quite a good one. And I'm sure you'll be aware of the scenarios that when you're working using CBT, you can give clients a scenario to kind of think about, so that they can maybe come up with some alternative ways of looking at things. So in the book, I give an example of, there's a friend that you see walking down the street. This is a white woman. She's walking down the street on the other side of the street, and you wave at her to try and catch her attention, but she doesn't respond. She just carries on walking. So you ask the question of the client, what would go through your mind? How would you feel about that? So some people would say, well, I'm really worried about that. I'm quite anxious because I thought she was my friend. And now I'm worried that she's actually deliberately ignoring me. And you'd go home and you'd dwell on it, and you'd be really, really worried. Or somebody else might get really angry and say, how dare you do that? That's a really racist thing to do. If you're a person of color, she's deliberately ignored me, and you get really angry and you begin to develop a grievance. Why do I bother talking to white people at all? So suppose you subsequently discovered through a mutual friend that this woman that you'd seen had just come out of a hospital appointment where she'd been diagnosed with a serious illness. What would go through your mind then? Now, I think what would go through my mind is, oh my goodness, no wonder this poor woman was so distracted and so full of her worries about her health. She wouldn't possibly have noticed me waving across the other side of the street. That would be the charitable conclusion that you'd come to,
Mm-hmm.
wouldn't it? But in the chapter, because I put critical race theory in the therapist's chair, in other words, to see what its worldviews are and how it thinks, critical race theory thinks, no, because it's looking for racism everywhere, this has to be a racist incident.
Mm-hmm.
And it doesn't matter whether the intention was not there, whether this woman, intended to ignore or not, and because they didn't have the intention, they were completely wrapped up in their own world. It's the impact that it has.
Mm-hmm.
So their lived experience is that this person ignored me and she was being racist, because perhaps if a white friend had been across the side of the street, she might have come over and talked to them. So you jump to that conclusion.
Mm-hmm.
There are all these cognitive distortions coming up, mind reading, sort of black and white thinking, catastrophizing, all these cognitive distortions. Now, in the chapter, I try and suggest to critical race theory, well, what about this? And they're not budging, because they see that as a microaggression, and they will not budge because it's such a fixed and rigid way of viewing the world. Everything is viewed through a racist lens. And the problem with that, and you can probably see this coming, Leslie, and Jonathan Haidt has pointed this out, is that actually, how do you do psychotherapy? How do you do CBT with somebody who thinks that even that sort of questioning about different perspectives is a microaggression? So can you say, I think this is why this anti-CBT movement, I mean, I know there has been a lot of anti-CBT feeling over years from other therapeutic approaches, but in this particular instance, critical social justice activists are seeing this as a victim blaming, colonial, really kind of rather nasty approach to working with people, which is denying their experiences of racism. Does that make sense?
It does make sense. And it's so the alternative is that it's always all about me, and it's always all about my perceptions. And this makes me think of the fundamental attribution error, which
Yes.
is, where a mistake that somebody else makes, or some infraction that somebody else makes, is based on, we attribute that to their character. And if we make a mistake, it's our circumstance, or it's not our character, it's just me making a mistake. And I have this game that I've played with my kids forever, where when we're driving, if somebody does something rude in traffic, drives too fast or cuts us off or something, we make up a story about why that person might have done that. Instead of getting mad at that person, we say, well, his dog just puked in his car and he's really upset. He needs to get somewhere quick. Or we make up some story about what's going on in that person's life, which could explain bad, what seems like bad behavior to us, instead of just thinking, oh, he's just a jerk.
Exactly, Leslie. And isn't that such a much more charitable way of viewing, giving people the benefit of the doubt, not rushing to judgment? You can do the same. I mean, maybe you're on the tube and somebody treads on your foot. London Underground, they tread on your foot, and then you see they've got a white stick. You kind of have to kind of think, maybe they're having a really bad day, and just give them the benefit of the doubt. But there is no room for that in critical race theory and critical social justice. There's no room for giving people the benefit of the doubt. It's very punitive, very rigid, and the whole idea, if you juxtapose that with CBT's looking for perspectives, isn't it? It takes you up in a sort of helicopter view and so that you can actually look down and see these different perspectives, and that's what I really like about it. But this is what they like least about it, because there is only one lens through which you see the world, and that's the racist lens, which is so limiting and inevitably leads to division, doesn't it? Because if you imagine what kind of conversation you might have with that poor woman who's just been diagnosed with a serious illness, well, you're just a racist. What is that person going to think? What is it going to do to people's relationships and friendships if they're always being accused of racism, and the person who's being accused feels like they are walking on eggshells all the time? It's not exactly a recipe for social cohesion, is it?
It's quite the opposite.
Exactly.
This CRT, it's stunning to me that it's being taught in therapy training, in counselor training, this stuff. I mean, I found this so surprising that they're actually teaching counselors to disregard white women's tears, for instance.
Yes.
And so that means that you're supposed to look at I was taught this. This was said in a class to me, that you're supposed to look at a white woman crying and feel some resentment because their tears have been overvalued. And I thought, well, what if she's coming in because her father died, or she's in the middle of a divorce, or she got that diagnosis that you're talking about? Still, like, that individual is supposed to be somehow diminished, like her feelings. You're supposed to calcify yourself against that as a therapist.
It doesn't make any sense, Leslie, does it? It's not. I think that's why in the book we talk about it being anti-therapeutic, because it is. You know, you wouldn't want to sit with a therapist who was judging you in that way and, you know, saying, well, that's just white women's tears. That's no place for that in a therapy room, is that? It's quite extraordinary that it's being taught. And I mean, we discovered all sorts of really worrying things that were going on in the clinical psychology training here in the UK. So we've got, again, just thinking about avoidance, for example, you know, and CBT would say that, you know, avoidance perpetuates anxiety. It's like a loop. And the more you avoid things, the more anxious you get. So on courses now, and I'm sure this is the case in the States, people of colour, students of colour, are being put in separate groups. They're giving little safe spaces and so on, which the white students don't get. The white students are expected to experience discomfort and the black students don't. And there was one of the courses that actually will not send black students to a white rural area. They just won't send them.
Wow.
And I think, okay, so how is that student going to cope when they finally graduate and find themselves in a majority white country having to work with white people? They even have a choice about supervisors, whether they can match the supervisors for ethnicity. I feel this is a route which is, you know, it's a really troubling route to take. And all the time it's perpetuating anxiety. And I'm thinking, these are clinical psychology training courses. Do they not know about the huge literature there is on avoidance and anxiety?
I can't imagine how they don't know. I can't imagine how they aren't aware of what they're doing. I mean, it's also like it's a re-education. It's training people to be worried about these things that maybe they came in not really thinking very much of. And that's what I'm hearing from people. I mean, I also went back to school later in life. This graduate program was later for me as well. I was in my, I guess I was in my early 40s when I started. So yeah, and similar I feel experience. Similar. Yeah, it's really interesting that you had that trajectory as well. But I feel like, and I've said this before, I think that being older than the other students, and I wasn't older than all of them. I was probably somewhere in the middle. There were some young people who were just out of college, and then some other people who were in my same kind of category, retraining into a new career. But being in the a little bit older, I think helped me to have more distance from how this has been steadily creeping into education, which I think I was kind of, I honestly, I was naive to that. I didn't know. Even my own daughters, who are in their 20s, were receiving some of this education, and I didn't realize it at the time because it wasn't on my radar. And I, in talking with them since, my 24-year-old, she's almost 24, was taught the genderbread man, for instance, when she was in high school. So yeah, this has been around for longer than I even realized when we go back and we talk about it. But I think that being older helped me to see it as a contrast to what I had been educated with prior.
Yeah.
And what you're saying there with like taking a student of color and deliberately telling them, we won't send you into that white area. What does that's a re-education. It's sending a new message to that person to say, you should feel afraid of this.
Exactly. It's actually perpetuating it, isn't it? Or not even, it may be actually triggering it.
Triggering, yes.
They may not have had that thought. I hate that word, but it actually is.
No, yeah,
it is
no.
appropriate in this
I know.
instance,
I know. I hate when I feel myself using some of the language that's become so part of their scripts.
Sullied, unfortunately, yeah.
Yeah.
Shame.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think this really concerns me, because I can't, there's a question about clinical competence here as well, isn't there?
Mm-hmm.
That, you know, that if you're going to have trainees who finally graduate and they don't have that skill. I think Christine's made this point, hasn't she, about some of the students that she was working with, that they just didn't have the ability to cope with some of this. And you think, well, you're going to get microaggressions when you meet. I mean, obviously, clients often have really difficult circumstances they're living in, and they may be really troubled, and they're not going to be that careful about what they say. How are students like this going to cope with that in the real world? And I think Christine said that 1 or 2 of them actually left the program because they couldn't cope with perceived microaggressions. So it just feels that the courses are actually storing up trouble here, really. And I can't imagine what these kind of activist therapists are going to be like when they actually get out into the real world, whether they'll stay with it or whether they'll just go on their crusade of morally re-educating people and trying to guide people into political activism, which is what it's meant to be now, isn't it? It's not
is
anymore.
No, it's activism as the first and foremost objective. And so I have two anecdotes about what you just said about students not being prepared to go out and being too sensitive or too fragile in their own lack of resilience around these issues. But I had a teacher who, we may have talked about this when we discussed my experience previously, but I had a teacher who cried in class over questions that I was asking in a similar tone to how I'm talking right now. I wasn't badgering her in any way. I was just trying to bring up concerns that I had around some of the things we were talking about. And she actually broke down in tears and cried about her emotional labor that she was putting in. And and then I had another conversation recently with a student, and I try to leave details out because I don't know if she wants to share that, but she brought up some questions that she had around some contradictions in the race and gender ideology that she was being taught in a therapy program. And the teacher responded saying that she was having a very somatic experience and was feeling triggered by what the student was asking, and cut the student off, and then reported the student to the administration in order to have her talked to because she was asking the wrong sorts of questions. And again, I don't want to go into the details too much because I don't want to out this person if they don't want to be outed, but it was shocking to me because these were the sorts of things that we're discussing right now. It wasn't something awful that the student was saying to attack. It was just recognizing contradiction and saying, what about this? How do we reconcile these things? And it was a very reasonable thing to be asking as it was related to me. And so if these are teachers, if these are professors in psychology programs teaching counselors and demonstrating this lack of ability to even hear student questions, how does this relate to when you're working with a client? How would these people be able to show up in the therapy space?
Well, they just couldn't cope, could they? There's something here about having to learn distress tolerance and emotional regulation, and this is something that you should be able to model to your students, not to just break down in tears because you can't cope with your students saying. And I am hearing this not necessarily from I'm hearing from students that this is happening on their course, but with other students, in a setting where perhaps they're having a reflective discussion or something like this, and somebody sort of dares to question what somebody's saying, and all hell breaks loose, and then suddenly the student finds themselves in deep trouble and wondering if they're going to be thrown off the course. And this just sounds chaotic to me, Leslie. This is not, when I did my training, and certainly when I was training others, it was all about modeling, adult behavior. It was about modeling managing your emotions and being able to impart information without getting really upset if somebody says something that who disagreeing with you. It is extraordinary. It feels almost like, I mean, I don't like using the word personality disorder, but doesn't it feel a little bit like that?
It does.
Yeah.
It does. And it feels like we're trying to generate that in people.
Yes. Yeah.
And encouraging that, and especially encouraging, I don't know who's getting the worst end of it. I don't know if it's the people who are being told that they're marginalized and encouraged to have these kind of continual grievances, or if it's the people who are being told that they're privileged and therefore need to suppress themselves. I don't know which side of that is actually being harmed more, because it seems like it's sort of harmful for everybody involved.
Yeah, I think that's right, Leslie. It is very harmful, and I think that's why it was really important to get this message out to people, you know, just who don't know this is going on. And this is where you've been doing such a brilliant job, Leslie, and I know there are others as well who are doing a similar thing. We just have to get this message out and try and find a way. I mean, I know Critical Therapy Antidote, I mean, we're doing our best to try and set up a kind of parallel organization where people will be able to find therapists who do not practice in this way. But it's actually being able to warn people what to look out for, isn't it? So that you make sure that you don't end up seeing somebody who is so troubled themselves. It's not therapy, is it? It really isn't therapy.
No.
I don't know quite what description to give to it, but it is anti-therapeutic.
Yeah, it's social engineering.
Social engineering.
So that, you know, the parallel organization, I'm so grateful for Critical Therapy Antidote in doing this, and it's such a wonderful network. And I have also, I guess I have these questions about what are we to do with the next generation of people coming into this field who are going through trainings right now? What are we, how it's like you're running a gauntlet right now if you're going into one of these programs and you don't agree with what they're teaching. I felt like I could not get through it. I you know, it was like the last year or so of it, I was stumbling through it one course at a time because my foot was out the door. I had one foot out the door because I thought, how can I patronize an institution that's doing something I find so harmful just to try to eke my way towards a piece of paper that lets me do something? And so I guess I'm trying to conceptualize what the answer is. We need some training programs that are not just social professional networks for professionals, but we also need training programs that are not going to scar people emotionally coming out of them. And, you know, like I'm still dealing with, I've got one foot in the door still with the school that I was in graduate school with. I'm not completely expelled from there, and I'm negotiating through an attorney right now are they going to give me back my tuition funds? Are they going to grant me my degree for basically time served because I'm close to the end of it? Or are they going to issue a public apology to me and tell me that they will not retaliate and let me continue to take my courses and finish my degree? So that's the kind of the crossroads where I am, and I don't know how that's going to end up, but I don't feel like people should have to be put through this, and I also don't feel like the training is worth the paper anymore necessarily. I have learned some good things. I really have. It's not all been bad. The skills classes have been great, and there have been some other courses that are very high quality, but there's this is more and more becoming the overriding message, is this: we're training you to be an activist, and we're training you to see your role as a social change agent for critical social justice.
That's right.
And so where do we go from here? We can't just tell people skip training and just go hang up a coach shingle, and because then they're lacking in a lot of skills as well. So what do you conceive of as the answer to this?
Well, I think Critical Therapy Antidote, well, I know Critical Therapy Antidote is trying to see whether there are ways of providing alternative traditional training so that you can fill the gaps. I guess the question comes is when eventually this traditional training perhaps will not be taught anymore. You really are going to need institutions that can offer that training. But certainly Critical Therapy Antidote is hoping to set up some trainings so that, you know, people who are kind of missing, perhaps it could be family therapy or whatever it is that you're missing, cognitive behavior therapy, that you will be able to get some training online from Critical Therapy Antidote. And I have a sense that there may be other organizations that will pop up as time goes by, in the same way as you're getting alternative universities that are popping up now. You know, that there are so many people now and so many networks of people who want to provide an alternative. I think that will happen. I'm quite optimistic about that, actually, because I think that will happen. And also in the same way as that you're providing solid ground, aren't you? We're also now, Christine is sort of working on trying to get some supervision sessions set up so that people from the CTA network can come and you know, talk about their difficulties in dealing with these situations, and then you can kind of pull your discussion and think, well, how did you cope with that? And you know, try and come up with ideas about how to deal with it. Maybe eventually there could be some kind of resources about how you might cope in certain situations, rather like counterweight to do. I mean, these are things for the future, but there's certainly things that, you know, are being thought about. So I think to go away on a note of optimism, that there are people working really hard, like yourself, to try and provide, not necessarily to be able to do anything about the current situation as it exists in training courses, but to provide an alternative. And I think that's the way that we have to go. And that's something I really look forward to being able to be part of, in the same way as you are, Leslie. I think, you know, we're part of a vanguard, and there is hope for the future. You know, I hope, if nothing else, well, it may have been a grim discussion about CBT today, but there is hope for the future. I'm sure of it.
Oh, I believe that as well. And I'm glad to hear that there's a lot underway there. And it does seem like there's this impulse to help and to be a part of something that is healthy for other people, and to generate positive results in people's lives that is undeniable. And it's something that this might be a diversion in the stream of therapy, but it's going to create an offshoot that's hopefully can find out a way to distinguish itself from what's being done to, you know, conventional therapy programs. And what I hope that this can turn into something that is really successful for clients and for professionals as well.
Yeah, absolutely, Leslie. I hope so too, and we'll do our best to make it so. And there are a lot of people coming along with us now, and we're growing in number, and I have a good feeling about it.
So looking into the future, you're optimistic?
Yes, I think so overall. I think, yes, there are going to be challenges. There's no doubt about it. But I think when you get to my age, Leslie, you kind of, what goes around comes around. Things change, the pendulum swings. I mean, okay, this is quite a massive upheaval that we're facing at the moment. But, you know, I go to various conferences. I meet a wide range of people who are all trying to not exactly swim against the tide, but trying to find ways through, you know, trying to find ways through this and solutions. And they're very clever people. And I just have a very, you know, kind-hearted people. And I just feel that because we're all pulling together, that eventually something good will come out of it. So I am optimistic. Yeah.
Well, I love to hear that. Thank you for sharing that.
Not at all.
Do you have any recommendations or links or things that you'd like to share with people, things that you'd like to recommend people go and see or read, or places that they can find you online?
Okay, well, I think first of all, I have to advertise this. Do go, please. If you've enjoyed this discussion today, do please go and get a copy of Cynical Therapies. And it's available in an ebook, and it's available in a paperback. And I think you'll enjoy it because it's got 19 authors writing from all sorts of different perspectives: Jungian, psychoanalytic, cognitive behavioral, you know, all sorts of social psychology. It's excellent. So there's something in it for everybody. And if you're interested in how critical social justice works and its worldview, and also seeing it analysed from a psychological perspective, and see how it doesn't stand up to scrutiny. Do have a look at that. That's fantastic. Mm-hmm. Otherwise, I'm also involved as far, obviously, Critical Therapy Antidote. So at Therapy Antidote on Twitter. I'm also part of an organisation called Don't Divide Us here in the UK, which is campaigning for trying to deal with the problems that are in education at the moment, particularly schools, what children are being taught. We're concerned about the re-racializing of society in particular, but also gender ideology. And so I'm on the advisory council of Don't Divide Us. So if you look up Don't Divide Us, I think it's don'tdivideus.com. We have a petition going at the moment to try and get the government to address the problem of third-party providers coming into schools and teaching on gender ideology and also on racism or anti-racism. So there's a petition going, but actually that's only for people in the UK. But yes, so Don't Divide Us, Critical Therapy Antidote, those are the two things, and the book.
Excellent. Okay. Excellent. Well, I'll make sure those links are below the video.
Thank you, Leslie. I much appreciate that.
Yeah,
it's been so lovely talking to you. Thank you for giving me the time to talk to you.
Thank you, Carole. I really appreciate you making the time and for sharing with me and with the people who will watch this. So
not at all. At all. I hope they enjoy it and maybe find out a little bit more about epistemic violence,
which is kind of a wild phrase.
Very well.
Yes. Okay. Well, thank you. I hope you get to do some more cake baking and gardening despite.
Thank you, Leslie.
Despite the bigger mission.
And you enjoy the rest of your day.
You too. Okay. Thank you.
Bye-bye then.
Bye-bye.
Bye.